Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of the TAPED podcast, the most untitled podcast in the world. I'm your host as always, Nostalgia, and joining me is my co-host,
MickyT, as always.
And today we have a very special episode. Some of you may have noticed that 2 days ago on April Fool's Day we did a bit of a goof.
We did a little bit of a goof, we did a little bit of a gaff.
Bit of left funny. We made a shit post, Led Zeppelin worst to best. Thank you, Luke, for hopping on and replacing me for that.
Thanks, Luke.
To add to the insanity.
It was an absolute treat to record, and it was absolutely jarring to listen back to because, yeah.
Part of me wanted to bass boost all the slurping and everything, but I think that would have been unlistenable.
Yeah, we wanted to save your ears, but yeah, with that in mind, though, we're back with an actual Led Zeppelin worst to best. For reals this time, we're actually going to be talking about the real Led Zeppelin and not the other one. But yeah, pretty much Led Zeppelin, one of the most iconic hard rock bands of all time. A very controversial one at that as well, because, you know, it's often debated what parts of their music are actually, like, original and all that, but either way, they've made some incredibly remarkable and iconic rock albums in their time, and we're going to talk about the 8 albums that they released during their tenure. Obviously, Coda is not going to be included since it's a B-sides comp, and yeah, we're going to start with number 8, and are you ready?
I'm ready.
Alright, so at the number 8 spot, in my opinion, Led Zeppelin's worst album is Presence.
Oh. In my opinion, Led Zeppelin's worst album is In Through the Outdoor. Not
very controversial at all. Let's just leave it at that. A while back when I was first checking out Led Zeppelin's discography for the first time, I only really heard their work up to Physical Graffiti. I never actually bothered to give what they did after that a listen, and I actually never even knew that these albums existed for the longest time. Like,
lucky.
They rarely get mentioned when people talk about Led Zeppelin, and, I was fairly curious as to why that was, and after listening to Presence for the first time, I totally get why, because, this is just fairly insignificant in their discography, in my opinion. To give credit to Presence, the opening track, Achilles' Last Stand, is actually a fantastic song, is easily the best track in the album, but after that, it's just really, blech, it's not that great. It just feels like there's something missing with every track. It doesn't really have the same energy and quality that I'd normally expect from Led Zeppelin. It sounds really bland, if anything. The production quality for me just takes a step down on so many tracks here. Instrumentally, it's fine, but it just sounds bland. The production isn't really doing it justice. And there's just so many bland, uninteresting passages as well that just don't really go anywhere that's all that interesting or really original. There's also the case with Robert Plant's vocals, which are pretty underwhelming and sound noticeably weak after a few tracks. That's more than likely due to the fact that during the recording, Plant was recovering from a car accident and was wheelchair bound as well, but, it's somewhat forgivable, but at the same time, it's very noticeable, and it doesn't really help that, he's backed by really bland instrumentals. I don't have much else to say besides that, since there just isn't really too much to say about Presence. The opening track is the most notable thing about it, but that's it. There's a reason why this has been forgotten.
Yeah, the band's final album, In Through the Outdoor, is my personal least favorite, and I think Presence also, definitely is in the lower echelon of Led Zeppelin's discography, but I really think that while Presence was kind of a decline, I feel like In Through the Outdoor was rock bottom for the band, in my opinion. I think just the Led Zeppelin that we get on this project is just throughout a shell of their former selves. This project literally just sounds like every other hard rock band in the late 70s. It's just missing that magic that made Led Zeppelin Led Zeppelin. And yeah, there's really throughout, as you said, Presence at least has some standout moments. I'll get to that in a sec, but In Through the Outdoor for me just really has none. I don't think there's anything on this album that stands out in any meaningful way. I think the Fool on the Rain maybe is a solid track, but even then it probably wouldn't even come close to best tracks on any other album. And yeah, let's be honest, most of the album just fucking stinks. The track Hot Dog in particular is just a fucking disaster, and it baffles me that it even exists. And you know, I don't know if I can't really sugarcoat things. I just don't like the album. I think it's bleak. It's just a shell of their former selves. It's uninspired. It does so many things that so many like other 70s hard rock bands just do over and over and over again. It just, I don't know. It no longer has any of that Led Zeppelin magic, that Led Zeppelin excitement. It's a low point, and unfortunately, it was their last album. So we never really got to see the band bounce back from this point on. But yeah, for me, it's definitely their worst album.
Yeah. My favorite track from Presence is Achilles' Last Stand. My least favorite track is For Your Life.
My favorite track on In Through the Outdoor, I guess, is Fool in the Rain. And obviously my least favorite track is Hot Dog.
I'll get to that shortly now, because my number 7 pick is In Through the Outdoor.
And my number 7 pick is Presence. Nobody's surprised.
No surprises here. Get the forgettable shit out of the way. And yeah, In Through the Outdoor, the final album in Led Zeppelin's discography. And following the death of John Bonham, you know, obviously the band would never be able to release a major project again. I mean, one would hope that the band's final album would be great, right? Well, unfortunately, In Through the Outdoor is a bit of a mixed bag. And you know, honestly, I do think it has its occasional solid moments, but there's some moments that are just pretty fucking brutal, if we're being honest. You know, what puts it above Presence for me is the production quality. I think that it sounds better in quality than the former, despite some of the dated synths, and despite how horrific some moments turn out to be. Also, I think John Bonham's drums generally just sound great on this album. Aside from that, In Through the Outdoor is just a bit of a mess. A somewhat funny mess, but like, it's still a mess regardless. The last few tracks in the album, I actually think are pretty solid, and they kind of do save this album from being the absolute rock bottom for me. But the bad kind of outweighs the good in this album, since the band decided to go all out with the synths, and they kind of blend them into their formula. And while some of them work on the final tracks, they don't for others, and the way they kind of blend in with the all over the place songwriting is honestly just quite campy, and it sounds really dated, and not even the good kind of campy. The band toy with more like weirdo, like pop, like sounds on this thing, like on Fool in the Rain and Hot Dog, which often just kind of like backfires and sounds horrific. Also, that like Caribbean flavored bridge is just fucking horrific on Fool in the Rain. Jesus Christ. They've made some pretty questionable tracks before, but honestly, this might be one of their worst in my opinion. That and Hot Dog, easily. Aside from the bad tracks on here, that doesn't really... I suppose that they don't really do too much for me in terms of riffs or vocals. The vocal effects on Robert Plant don't really sound great either. I mean, it's a mixed bag, and I do genuinely like the last couple of tracks, which is why I put it above Presence, but it's a pretty disappointing end to their discography if you're going through the entire thing, and yeah, it's a shame, really.
Yeah, my number 7 pick was Presence, the band's penultimate album. And yeah, Presence is, ultimately still another low point in Zeppelin's career. Yeah, for me, unlike In Through the Outdoor, I think there's still somewhat of an essence of what made Led Zeppelin great on this album. It's still present on here, albeit in rather small doses. The opening track in particular is incredible and had me falsely prepared for yet another classic album. However, obviously that really didn't come through fruition. And there's just an immediate drop off in terms of quality after that. And there's also a clear drop off in terms of quality when you're looking at their entire discography, because this project directly follows Physical Graffiti, one of the band's best albums, an album that is just saturated in quality. And when compared to that project, this one is clearly very thin. There's not a lot to talk about here. There's not a lot of standout moments, and it does, showcase a band that is on a decline, creatively, in terms of just the quality of the instrumentation, in terms of even the passion on a lot of moments here. It just seems like they're just shooing it in here. But it's I don't think it's an awful album. I think it has some merit, and it definitely does ultimately seem worse than it is when compared to the albums that it followed. But I mean, it sounds like a Led Zeppelin album, I'll give it that, but it doesn't sound like a very good one.
Yeah, in fact, it sounds like a very boring one. Yeah. Okay, so my favorite tracks from In Through the Outdoor are All of My Love and I'm Gonna Crawl. Worst tracks are Fool in the Rain and Hot Dog. They give me PTSD. Let's be real.
My favorite track on Presence is obviously Achilles' Last Stand. My least favorite track was Candy Store Rock.
Oh, Jesus Christ. Fucking hell. Alright, we're moving on to our number 6 picks now. And I chose Houses of the Holy.
I chose Led Zeppelin 1.
Damn. Well, I already know people are going to be mad at me for my take on Houses of the Holy, because I know a lot of people love that album, but just to get that out of the way, I'm not too fond of Houses of the Holy. I know there's a ton of people that love this album to death and consider it one of Led Zeppelin's best, and all power to those people, but for me at least, it's honestly one of the band's more overrated albums, and that's for a few reasons in my opinion. To start with positives, I like that Houses of the Holy takes a more dodgy approach in contrast with what the band did before. They experiment with different ideas and toy with more prog-esque tendencies, and on that merit, Houses of the Holy is a very respectable album. Even for as much material there is on this album, I'm not too fond of. There's, a few great tracks here, like the Rain Song and No Quarter especially. Plus, even on some of the more lackluster cuts, there's some pretty solid instrumental passages and moments. But aside from that, I think Houses of the Holy is alright, but it's very flawed. My biggest gripe is that Houses of the Holy is, my biggest gripe with it is that the vocals aren't that great, honestly. I don't know what happened between this album and Led Zeppelin 4, but there are moments where Plant's vocals honestly sound unbearable, like on The Ocean and The Crunge. Whenever he isn't unbearable, he just sounds really flat and lifeless. It just doesn't really seem like he's bringing the same energy or charisma that I usually like from him, but simultaneously, when he tries to do it, he just sounds annoying. Some of my least favorite Led Zeppelin tracks from this era are on this album as well. That's mainly down to how dodgy and, to be honest, awful some of the song ideas are on this. Like, The Crunch specifically, which is just such a goofy and malformed song, and Dire Maker is just, ew. Ugh. This album is saved by the good tracks that it has, and the production, and some of the instrumental passages, and I guess I do respect this album more than I enjoy it. And, it just comes off really malformed and unlikable. All power to the people that like this album. I just don't really like it.
I don't think yours is going to be as unpopular as mine. I went with the band's debut, an album that is undoubtedly iconic and beloved by many. And, it's, for me, no surprise that it sparked into the band's worldwide success almost immediately. The material on here is absolutely spectacular. The band's mix of blues and hard rock was so well executed, and that was in no small part to the just sheer talent of every single member of the band. Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You, Dazed and Confused, there's a lot of undeniable classics on this album, and while it does wear a lot of its blues influences on its sleeves, maybe oftentimes a little too much, I still personally never really understood the jabs at Zeppelin over their lack of originality, when a lot of blues involves covers and taking riffs. A lot of early rock and roll just in general took inspiration and riffs and borrowed, quote unquote borrowed, from African American artists of the 30s and 20s. So it's not like Led Zeppelin were the first to ever do anything of the sort. But I really do think that their sheer just talent as musicians, and even with, you know, a lot of the borrowed motifs, lyrics, riffs, anything, they still do have a lot of creativity. They definitely display a lot of creativity and pump their own unique spin into every track they do. And you know what, the plagiarism things just never really bothered me. Personally, I never really hold that as a gripe against Led Zeppelin. But to get back to Led Zeppelin 1, I just went on a tangent because a lot of those moments do appear on here. I think this album is far from perfect. I think the highlights are incredible. But it does have a few slower moments, and moments that honestly just to me don't really stand out. You Shook Me and I Can't Quit You Baby, for example, are honestly just quite boring. They just kind of seem like a pastiche of other blues rock bands of the 60s and 70s. There's none of that excitement that, you know, made Led Zeppelin stand out. But all in all, I still think it's a very good album. And at its best, it's an incredible album. But for me, I just feel like it has a few tracks and moments that just really bring it down and just fail to engrave its name in the upper echelon of Led Zeppelin albums for me.
Fair enough, and apologies for my chair. It is super fucking loud. I don't know why. It is pissing me the fuck off, but anyways, my favourite tracks from Houses of the Holy are the Rain Song, Over the Hills, and Far Away. Over the Hills and Far Away, and No Quarter. The worst track is The Crunge. More like The Cringe.
My favourite tracks... Oh, did you...
I just said get fucked.
Oh, I couldn't hear you. Alright, my favourite tracks on Led Zeppelin 1 are Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You, Dazed and Confused, and Your Time Is Gonna Come. My least favourite tracks are the aforementioned You Shook Me and I Can't Quit You Baby.
Okay, we're moving on to our number 5 picks, and oh shit, another hot take from me. I chose Led Zeppelin 2.
Oh, I chose Led Zeppelin 3.
I also know that a ton of people love Led Zeppelin 2 and see it as one of the band's best albums. I even used to think that way back when I was first getting into Led Zeppelin, but honestly, time has seen this album grow off me a little bit, and it's probably my least favourite one out of the 4 self-titled albums. It's still good, don't get me wrong, but I have a couple of gripes with the album. For one, I just think that all the best songs are honestly on the back end of the album. Whole Lotta Love is a great entry point on the album, but the other few songs after that just don't do too much for me, especially the Lemon song, which I honestly can't stand if I'm being real here. Also, the band's sound is still, very much in this raw stage in terms of their production. I mean, that's to be expected since, this album only came out mere months after their debut. But there are some moments where it just sounds noticeably muddy and just sounds kind of off-putting to me. I will say, though, it picks up tremendously after the 4th track as it just goes off from Heartbreaker onwards. The aforementioned, that aforementioned track is one of my favorite riffs on any Led Zeppelin song. I love the hook on Living Loving Maid. I love the folkier Ramble On. The riff on Moby Dick is fantastic, and I love the solo portion where, Bonham is just fucking around with his drums. That is great. And the final track, Bring It Back Home, is fucking great. The performances, obviously, the musicianship is incredible. John Paul Jones especially, some of his best bass work is all over this album. Jimmy Page is going off, Bonham is going off, and Robert Plant still sounds pretty good in this stage of his career. And as a whole, I just think that it's a solid album despite what I don't really care for off of it. That's my only main gripe with it. Just those 3 tracks after Whole Lotta Love. After that, it just becomes a very good album. It's good. I get that I'm in the minority with this placement, but, I'm okay with that. I genuinely think it's a very good album regardless. It has some great songs on it. And, as a whole, I still think it's a pretty good album.
I went with the next album in their discography. I went with Led Zeppelin 3. And whereas the band's 2 earlier outings were a little more balls to the wall in terms of just raw energy, I think this album starts to see Led Zeppelin mellow down a little bit and take in some more inspirations outside of just blues, notably folk and even some hints of prog rock on here. But, I just don't think that ultimately it makes for something memorable, and I think that all that memorable. There's obviously some very notable exceptions, and I do think that those folk stylings and even those kind of proggy stylings are a lot better executed on later projects, which I will talk about. And yeah, I do think that, the change in sound was definitely a welcome one, but for when it comes to personal taste, I just never really gravitated to a lot of the tracks on this album, aside from, the very notable one.
Of course.
Yeah, I'll get the highlights out of the way first. Immigrant Song, undeniable classic, one of the best songs of the 70s period. Since I've Been Loving You is brilliant. I have no idea how to say it, but Bron, why our stop? There's is it? I don't know. I'm not gonna attempt it, but
I just call it Bronny R Stop.
Bronny R Stop. There we go. I think that was a very tasteful ode to the blues and folk sounds of the early 20th century. Sounds that obviously heavily inspired the band. And That's the Way is probably one of my favorite of Led Zeppelin's more mellow tracks. But as a whole, I just think there's just more complete albums in their discography, and albums that just from start to finish feel a little more fulfilling and just complete. However, I still think this album's very good. Just like Led Zeppelin 1, I do think this album's very good. I think it's worth everyone's time, and I think that there's something here for everyone. And, Immigrant Song kind of is a cheat code when it comes to that, because who the fuck doesn't love the track? It's amazing. Yeah. But yeah, I think it's certainly a good album. And, I think its status as one of the many good self-titled projects maybe is why it's sometimes a little forgotten outside of just the hardcore Led Zeppelin fans. And when it lives in the shadow of the iconic Led Zeppelin 4, and Led Zeppelin 1, let's be honest, despite my opinion, it's not too hard to see why this one kind of gets overlooked. But I don't think that's fair, because I think it has some incredible moments.
Yeah, okay. My favorite tracks from Led Zeppelin 2 are Heartbreaker, Moby Dick, and Bring It On Home. The worst track is the Lemon Song. I do not need to hear about Robert Plant's lemon getting squeezed. Cheers.
My favorite tracks on Led Zeppelin 3 are Immigrant Song, Since I've Been Loving You, and That's the Way. My least favorite track is Hats Off to Roy Harper.
Okay, we're moving on to our number 4 picks, and I chose Led Zeppelin 1.
I chose Houses of the Holy.
Alright. Led Zeppelin's debut is probably one of the most beloved rock debuts from the 60s, and it's honestly a debut that made Led Zeppelin the household name in the world of music from the get-go. And it's not a perfect album, it does have its flaws, but for a debut, for me, it goes off and it has moments that just kick ass. The debut album is very much Led Zeppelin in a more raw presentation, and in turn it allowed the band to create some expansive, bombastic, and blistering classic hard rock. The album itself has moments that are more lengthy, there's some interesting passages being thrown into the compositions, and there's a lot of different moods and tracks that take... Oh, excuse me. There are different moods that the tracks take. Now, about how original some of the tracks are, it's debatable. Honestly, I don't care, but if you care, fair enough. But either way, most of it is just really great to me, and when we take into account tracks like Communication Breakdown, at the closing track, How Many More Times, Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You, You Shook Me, and come on, Dazed and Confused, fucking incredible song. Like, these all make a great album, in my opinion. Led Zeppelin's sound generally, it's very flashy, instrumental-wise, but what they did on this album pretty much revolutionized hard rock for its time. So on that merit, this album is revolutionary and influential, but it also showcased how great performance-wise the band were, especially John Bonham, who's like thunderous, and tight drumming is consistently fantastic. Robert Plant's wild vocals and inflections are just great on here. John Paul Jones sounds really good on here too, and some of Jimmy Page's best guitar work is on this album, and at points it's just phenomenal. Where it falters is in some of the production, in my opinion. It does lend itself well to moments here, but a lot of the time you can hear a lot of blemishes and mistakes, and there's a few tracks in the album that just feel fairly unmemorable and rough. Some tracks even meander for way too long as well, with certain middle sections and such. Aside from that, Led Zeppelin 1 is great in my opinion. It's a great debut, it's a great start to their discography, and for all its faults and questionable moments, it goes off in my opinion. And just a lot of great stuff on here from me. Some of my favourite Led Zeppelin tracks are on this thing as well. And Yeah, it's pretty good. Pretty good is one way to put it, I guess.
My number 4 pick was Houses of the Holy. I will admit, this album didn't immediately click with me, but over time and over consecutive listens, I've kind of started to really appreciate what it has to offer. It certainly, in my opinion, is the least immediate Led Zeppelin album. It doesn't have the kinds of, explosive moments that stood out on the band's previous 4 albums, or 4 self-titled albums. And instead, I feel like this album tries to kind of carve out a path of its own in their discography, which I think is why, dropping the whole self-titled thing was kind of a good idea at this point in time. It was different than those albums for sure. And yeah, I think the best way to describe this project for me is just overall eclectic. I think it's the most eclectic in their discography. I think it's at times the most ambitious. It sees the band blend in a lot of prog elements on this project, some art rock elements, even some psychedelic elements, and, kind of put the bluesy style that made them so memorable and made them the icons they are on the back burner for a lot of this project. The folk rock part of them and even the proggy part of them, I think, takes center stage more often than the bluesy twists on their tracks. And I think that this variety, of sounds and ideas, it definitely doesn't lend itself to, just the explosive moments that were on previous Led Zeppelin albums. But I think over time I've learned to kind of appreciate the more subtle moments and, take in the intricacies of the instrumentation and the songwriting and the vocal work. I know you had some complaints about, but I genuinely pretty much enjoyed every moment on this album vocally. But I will say there's a massive but. There is one fucking awful dud in a track listing, and that is obviously the crunge. It sounds like a Led Zeppelin reject track. It doesn't belong on any studio album. It sounds like something they might have shit out if they were fucking rehearsing or something. But even with that in mind, I think the album's ambition, the album's charm, and the album's slight intricacies don't go unnoticed in my book. And overall, I think it's a great album, and it could be one that potentially grows on me even further. But we'll have to see about that.
Alright, so my favourite tracks on Led Zeppelin 1 are Babe I'm Gonna Leave You, Dazed and Confused, which is it's a contender for my favourite Led Zeppelin song, and Communication Breakdown. My least favourite track is Black Mountain Side.
My favourite tracks on Houses of the Holy are The Song Remains the Same, Over the Hills and Far Away, and No Quarter. My least favourite track is obviously The Cringe.
I don't know why that exists. Jesus Christ. We're moving on to the top 3 now. And fittingly, my third pick is Led Zeppelin 3.
My third pick is Led Zeppelin 4.
Ooh, wow. Right. Anyways, the third self-titled Led Zeppelin album was considered a bit of a disappointing album when it came out. For whatever reasons that may be, these days Led Zeppelin 3 is kind of looked on more fondly. To be honest, I think that it's one of their best albums. It used to be my least favourite self-titled Led Zeppelin album, but I've seen the light, and now it's easily one of my favourite ones. The first 2 albums were, for me at least, Led Zeppelin were honing their blues rock and hard rock sounds while also not being afraid to show some sonic expansion. And Led Zeppelin do even more of that on 3 by incorporating more folky instrumentation, and on the second half of the album especially, and by upping their production value too. And to be honest, I think this is one of the best sounding Led Zeppelin albums. It feels more refined and pristine, allowing for the band to dish out some consistently fantastic sounding material. And the direction they took with the more folky elements makes Led Zeppelin 3 stand out as a completely unique album for them, and the band sound great while doing it. Some of my favourite riffs from Jimmy Page are all over this album. Out on the Tiles, Celebration Day, which is such a fucking underrated Led Zeppelin song. It kicks ass. And of course the legendary Immigrant Song, which is obviously one of the best Led Zeppelin songs, period. Even one of the best hard rock songs ever. One of the best songs of the 70s even. His guitar work on the more folkier cuts are great as well. I love them. Bonham and John Paul Jones sound great on here too, and Robert Plant is busting out some of his best vocals in my opinion. Generally, I just love almost every song on this thing. I think that the cleaner sounds lend well to a lot of tracks on here. The performances and the songwriting are captivating on a lot of tracks here as well. And there are ones that I would consider to be some of the band's best, frankly. The last track is probably the only real stinker on the track list, but hey, at least it's the last track, so you don't technically have to finish it. So, yeah, I love this album. I think that it's great. It gets overlooked a lot in Led Zeppelin rankings, and it should not be, might I add. And yeah, as a whole, I think that the sheer quality of this album is what makes it great for me. Love it to bits, and yeah, it's my third pick.
I went with the band's iconic fourth album, aptly titled Led Zeppelin 4. And
well, it is technically untitled.
Yeah, but it's titled Led Zeppelin 4 by fans because it is their fourth album.
I know. I'm just being
still.
an ass. I'm just being an ass, I know.
Yeah. Even though it's not my favorite album, I have to admit that when I think of Led Zeppelin, this is the album that immediately just is conjured up in my mind. And it's really through and through as iconic as rock music gets. And of course, for a lot of people, Stairway to Heaven is not only the Led Zeppelin song, it's the rock song, period. And despite it only ranking third for me, I still love this album, and I love practically everything about it. Black Dog is groovy and iconic. Rock and Roll is just addicting and impossible not to love. One of my favorite tracks from the band for sure. The Battle for Evermore is a very unique and subtle moment on the album. Despite not being exactly the track most people will think of. When the Levee Breaks is instrumentally just so crushing and triumphant.
The drums sound fucking incredible on that song. Holy shit!
Yes.
Also, I love how the Beastie Boys sampled that on the opening track to their album alongside a Black Sabbath riff. Just saying.
Yeah, I've heard that track. It's definitely one of the most iconic drum lines ever. Period. For a reason. Yeah. And then of course we have Stairway to Heaven, which is just a folk rock / hard rock masterpiece from start to finish, and it's easy to say it's going to live in like music folklore for all eternity. But I mean, this is just a great album through and through. I think the complaints I can throw its way are scarce. Maybe I'll say that I don't think Four Sticks is a great track and kind of slows the album down. But honestly, that doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things when, the track listing is as saturated and packed full of amazing material as it is. I suppose that it's just the little nuances in the top two albums that, for me personally, and I want to highlight personally, just make me gravitate towards them more so than this record. But I mean, this album's iconic, it's amazing, and it's just like a must hear for everyone. And honestly, even if I was to just make people who have never listened to Led Zeppelin listen to one album, it would still probably be this album because of just how iconic every moment on this thing is.
I agree. I heavily agree. Yeah. And do you have anything else to say?
No.
Okay. My favorite tracks on Led Zeppelin 3 are Immigrant Song, Celebration Day, and Tangerine. My least favorite track is Hats Off to Roy Harper. I'm sorry, Roy.
My favorite tracks on Led Zeppelin 4, aka Untitled, are Rock and Roll, Stairway to Heaven, and When the Levee Breaks. My least favorite track is Four Sticks.
We're moving on to the top two now. And for me, Led Zeppelin's second best album is Physical Graffiti.
And I agree.
Right. Physical Graffiti is literally and metaphorically Led Zeppelin's biggest album. It's a double album that sees the band take their sound into one huge cohesive package, and not for a single moment does it falter for me. I think that it's a fantastic album. It's an incredible album, honestly. It's incredibly consistent. I think that it's one of Led Zeppelin's best albums, and it's one of my favorite double albums of all time. Physical Graffiti takes from every era of Led Zeppelin's music that came before it. The early raw blues rock sounds of Led Zeppelin 1 and 2, the folk aspects of Led Zeppelin 3, the refined and straightforward songwriting of 4, the odd aspects of Houses of the Holy as well. And there's just such a huge variety to what we have from the band on here. And on that merit, it's that variety that makes the album a journey, and a really fun journey at that. You know, this doesn't stop Led Zeppelin from expanding with additional bits of instrumentation and the occasional synths here and there, and which, for me, are implemented very well and add a ton to their respective tracks. For me, Physical Graffiti is hands down one of the best sounding Led Zeppelin albums. It sounds fantastic from front to back. Jimmy Page did an excellent job on that front, given how crisp yet punchy it sounds. The band's refined efforts shows itself in spades all over this album, and it makes her some of the band's absolute best songs, like In My Time of Dying, which is amazing, The Rover, which is another one of my favorite Jimmy Page riffs, In the Light as well, Boogie with Stu, which is really fun, and of course Kashmir. What an iconic and amazing song that is. It's probably, I know this word is kind of like ruined now, but it's epic. It's it's so epic in scale, and the strings just add so much to it. It is honestly just insane. It is a beast of a track, and it's easily one of their best, if not the best. The band sound fantastic yet again on Physical Graffiti. Robert Plant is great on this thing. John Paul Jones is solid here too. Bonham is on fire consistently throughout this album too. I mean, he's considered one of the best drummers of all time for a reason. And Jimmy Page is just impeccable on this album. I'd even go as far as to say that this is the best album to go to if you want to hear some of Jimmy Page's best guitar work ever. They just sound fantastic as a unit on this thing, and even when the album is 80 minutes in length, I have barely any bad things to say about it. I don't think there's even a weak moment on this album. And even if there is, I think it's at the very least good. This album is fantastic to me. There isn't a single song that I would consider skipping or anything like that, because to put it bluntly, I just think that it's amazing. It's one of the most consistent double albums of all time for me. It's one of the best albums that the band have ever made. It's an amazing double album, and as a whole, it's just a fantastic journey. There's just one Zepp album that I prefer.
Yeah, Physical Graffiti is, as you said, an amazing album, and it was really, really close to clinching top spot, like really close, and for me, it just missed out. I'll explain why, but I'll start with the positives. I think the highlights of this album, which there are quite a number, are some of the most brilliant moments in music in the 70s overall, let alone in Led Zeppelin's discography. I think this album kind of sees them explore a sound that overall is more akin to their first four records rather than the album that came before it, Houses of the Holy. But, you know, unlike their first, I'll say unlike Houses of the Holy, which kind of saw the band try and venture outside of their comfort zone in a way, I think this project really kind of sees them stick in their comfort zone, but explore the limits and depths of that zone, of that signature sound and bluesy influences and of everything that made Led Zeppelin. And it does so in one of the most spectacular ways I could have ever imagined. This project is compositionally more ambitious, more fierce, more explorative, and more epic than anything they had released previously. Tracks like In My Time of Dying, 10 Years Gone, In a Light, and of course the legendary Kashmir are some of the most incredible moments in the band's entire discography. And, you know, a lot of the tracks on this album are just so winding and massive and gargantuan, yet they still remain very infectious and energetic and iconic and just fun through and through, which I think fun is the essence of what makes good Led Zeppelin for me. At the end of the day, if you kind of distill it to its most basic form, I just love a fucking good kick-ass Led Zeppelin track because it's fun.
Yes.
It's an incredible album. It's a massive album. Obviously, as you said, it is a double album, so it's massive in a very literal sense. And I think it really does a very good job of just bringing the absolute best out of their bluesy hard rock style. However, it isn't my number one pick, and honestly, I think the album does kind of drop off at the end for me. I think that Night Flight is the last truly amazing track, And then the last 4 albums, for me, are just... they could have been cut. I don't really care for any of them. The Wonton Song and Sick Again are decent, but at the same time...
Do you mean song or... Do you mean the songs or the albums?
The
You said
songs,
albums.
the last 4 songs. Yeah, the last 4 songs. I think the Wonton Song and Sick Again are decent, but don't really do anything that none of the earlier tracks managed to do, and definitely don't stick out among a crowd as outstanding as the track listing on this project. And then there's Boogie with Stu and Black Country Woman, which for me personally are just not good. Particularly Boogie with Stu, which has some of my least favorite mixing on any Led Zeppelin song ever. The drums sound like they were fucking ripped off an early Car Seat Headrest album. Then the fucking vocals sound like they were right off the White Stripes debut. And then you mix that with a piano that is just so high and prominent in the mix that it just overpowers the fuck out of everything else. Then the acoustic guitar is just so much higher in the mix than the electric guitar. Yes, there is actually an electric guitar in the mix somewhere. If you really listen hard enough, you'll hear it muddling its way through the background. It sounds like it was just it put together with Pritt Stick.
Bruh, that was one of my favorites on the album. What the fuck?
Yeah, I don't like that track.
No,
but
I definitely get Black Country Woman though. I definitely get Black Country Woman.
Yeah, that one's just boring rather than anything else. Fortunately, the unimpressive moments are a small fraction of what is, again, a double album. And also, fortunately, they're all packed at the very end neatly. The last 4 tracks. So if it's very much possible just to not listen to the last 4 tracks if I don't want to. So there's that. But overall, I think this album is still amazing. It's still an outstanding achievement in their discography. And yeah, I love it.
Alright, so I chose favorite tracks from both discs. So on disc 1, my favorite tracks from Physical Graffiti are The Rover, In My Time of Dying, and Kashmir. On the second disc, In the Light, Night Flight, and Boogie with Stu. My least favorite track is Black Country Woman.
I just did 3 overall, which was quite the task. But my 3 favorite tracks on this album are In My Time of Dying, Kashmir, my favorite Led Zeppelin song, and Down by the Seaside.
Alright.
Oh, my least favorite tracks. It's the 2 I mentioned, Boogie with Stu and Black Country Woman.
Shit. Right. Okay, we're moving on to our number 1 spots now. And if it wasn't obvious already, my number 1 pick is Led Zeppelin 4, the Untitled album.
My number 1 pick is Led Zeppelin 2.
So yeah, Led Zeppelin 4. My opinion, it's the band's best album. It's my personal favorite Led Zeppelin album. And for me, it's easily one of the greatest rock albums ever made. It just feels like the album that Led Zeppelin were building up to with their previous work. It combines elements of each of those albums, and from there we get a stellar album that has some of the band's best tracks, songwriting, and performances ever. Not to mention, it's an album that's just consistently fantastic and is, for me, at least the most consistent Led Zeppelin have ever been. The band at this point regrouped after the reception of Led Zeppelin 3 and decided to work on their Untitled album, which was pretty much a culmination, like I said, of everything Led Zeppelin were doing up to this point, from the hard rock that they were akin to on their first couple of albums, then the folk rock of 3. They refined everything that they were doing up to this point, and as a result, we get the band's most refined, thrilling, and consistent album ever. It's not exactly the most forward-thinking or even the Led Zeppelin album that's the most out there. But either way, it's just a fantastic album that substitutes the expansiveness and I guess just the will to experiment just with straight up fantastic songs, fantastic production with impeccable just soundscapes and just refinedness and just fantastic performances. And generally, it's just a fantastic experience from front to back. There's tracks in this album that I would consider some of the best rock songs of all time. There's so many timeless and legendary songs on here that it's insane. And for how straightforward some of the ideas are on this thing, this album just goes so hard and they leave just such a great impression on me. Like, come on, Black Dog, Rock and Roll, Battle of Evermore, Going to California, When the Levee Breaks, which is a fucking amazing closer. And, of course, Stairway to Heaven, which, like you said, is considered not only one of the best Led Zeppelin songs, but one of the best rock songs ever. And it's easy to see why. That song is just... It's a classic. It's amazing. The guitar solo at the back end still gives me chills, honestly. It's so good.
Yeah.
The production is amazing. The way John Bonham's drums sound in this album is phenomenal. It's one of the best drum sounds from any album ever. Jimmy Page's guitar work is fantastic. John Paul Jones' bass work is fantastic. And Robert Plant sounds impeccable on here. It's probably the album that has just some of my favourite performances from Robert Plant in general. Led Zeppelin's fourth self-titled album is easily the band's best body of work in my eyes, but I also think that it's the quintessential classic hard rock album. It defines what hard rock should strive to be, and in the process it contains some incredible pieces of hard rock material that has stood the test of time and has aged gracefully, unlike many others from this era. I just see no hard rock album even coming close to touching this, and it's one that it's also the Led Zeppelin album I return to the most, and it's probably my go-to whenever I'm in the mood for some loop zoop. So it's it's my favorite album from them. It's the album that I would definitely recommend to a newcomer who wants to get into Led Zeppelin. And for me, it's just their best album by a thin margin, mind you, because Physical Graffiti is definitely up there for me, but Led Zeppelin 4 is just fantastic, in my opinion.
My number one pick was Led Zeppelin 2. And for me, this has been my favorite Led Zeppelin album for pretty much as long as I can remember. And, I went into re-listening all the albums open-minded, accepting the fact that maybe it hasn't aged as well as I remember it to have aged, because it has been maybe like a year and a half since I have listened to it. Obviously before preparing for this episode. But for me, it's the one that clicks with me the most. And it just is one of the band's two peaks, in my opinion, the other being Physical Graffiti. But I think the thing that made me go with this album again over Physical Graffiti is just, personally, consistency. I think that the high points on this album are pretty much on par with the high points on Physical Graffiti, but Physical Graffiti is a little long-winded and does wane off at the end. And ultimately, it was, as I said, very close, so that was ultimately the deciding factor. But enough about Physical Graffiti. I should probably talk about the album I actually picked. I think that Led Zeppelin 2 takes the foundations the band set on their debut, blending hard rock with blues, and they really made it stand out in terms of just creativity on this project. I feel like they took that foundation that they had set for themselves and just really captured lightning in a bottle in terms of just creativity and playfulness on this project. Just even looking at, obviously, the iconic Whole Lotta Love, the fact that it starts with just a fiery bluesy jam, and then it goes into this really odd, surreal, psychedelic section, and then straight into a killer guitar solo, back into that bluesy jam. I think that track perfectly captures, I think, the essence of this album for me, and it feels like the band letting out their creativity and just having a blast with the music. It's just, in my opinion, the most just out there and just wild and just fun Led Zeppelin album, which, as I said previously, is the most important thing in the Led Zeppelin album for me. Fun. As I already mentioned Whole Lotta Love, but that's my personal second favorite Led Zeppelin track. My personal third favorite Led Zeppelin song, Ramble On, is also on this project, as well as a number of other highlights like Thank You and Heartbreaker. I just think this album is killer from start to finish. I think the instrumentation is fantastic, and every member really gives it their own. Obviously, as a drummer, I really have to mention Moby Dick. I think the only gripe I have with that track is that it's not the full 15-minute version, but understandably,
there's a 15-minute version.
Oh yeah, it's like the most legendary drum solo of all time, the 15-minute version of it.
Wow, I need to listen to that fucking ASAP.
Yeah, the Moby Dick that's on the album is just, it doesn't really capture the magic of that. But I admittedly, I kind of understand why putting a 15-minute drum solo on your how long is this album? Like 40 minutes?
Something like that, yeah.
On your 40-minute rock record probably isn't the best idea. But still, I think that track is amazing, and I think that the riff on it is one of my favorite Led Zeppelin riffs, even though it's not usually the thing you think of when you think of Moby Dick. But yeah, I think the production on this album also is very raw, and I think that I know you mentioned that you don't really care too much for the production. I think it just is. It adds to the wild and playful nature for me. And from start to finish, I think that this is always going to be the album that I'm going to be the most excited to listen to in terms of Led Zeppelin's discography. It's always going to be my standout, my pick of the bunch, and understandably, it's not going to be the case for everyone. But for me, it's just amazing.
Understandable. And with that in mind, my favorite tracks from Led Zeppelin 4 are Black Dog, Stairway to Heaven, and When the Levee Breaks. My least favorite track is none of them, because it is all fucking killer.
My favorite tracks on Led Zeppelin 2 are A Whole Lot of Love, Thank You, and Ramble On. My least favorite track, I suppose, in the same way that Fool in the Rain was my favorite track on In Through the Outdoor, is probably... God. I guess Living, Loving, Made is only like a 7 out of 10.
That's one of my favorites off that album. Fuck. One of, actually. I don't even think I mentioned it in my one. Holy shit, wait a minute. Yeah, I didn't, but it's like top 4 in the album for me. Love it. And, yeah, we did it. We did a real Led Zeppelin worst to best. We actually did a real one. Totally not a fake one. And, yeah, that was fun. And, with that in mind, of course, thank you all so much for watching. We really appreciate it. Let us know how you would rank Led Zeppelin's discography down below. We'd be very interested to know. Of course, necessary links to all of our Album of the Year and Rate Your Music pages, as well as our individual channels, will be in the description as well. If you want to support us, you can join the Patreon down below as well. There's different tiers that have different perks with them. Obviously, some of them could play into what we do on the channel, so if you would like to, that would be great. But obviously the best way to support us is just by subscribing and watching listening to the podcast as well. Shout outs to all the Spotify listeners as well. Shouts out to our one patron, Joshua. Cheers, Joshua.
Hey.
Should have said that at the start, but whatever, we'll get used to that. And yeah, that was our Led Zeppelin worst to best. As always, I've been MickyT.
I've been Nostalgia.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.